The flash of red and blue lights filled my living room as I stared in disbelief at the 3 patrol cars blocking my driveway. Sheriff Sheila emerged from her vehicle, clipboard in one hand, camera in the other, a triumphant smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. Behind her, 2 deputies began unloading empty containers from their truck. My heart sank. I knew exactly what was happening. By order of County Ordnance Enforcement, we are confiscating all illegal water collection equipment, she announced loud enough for the growing crowd of neighbors to hear. Her voice carried across my front yard like a verdict being read in court. I stepped forward, documentation in hand. This system is completely legal. I have all the permits in. The papers were snatched from my grip and tossed onto the wet ground. The rain that had fallen overnight, the very water I had been carefully collecting, now soaked through my legal protections. "You can tell it to the judge," Sheriff Sheila said, signaling to her deputies. "Take it all." I watched helplessly as they dismantled 5 years of sustainable living efforts while my neighbors witnessed my humiliation. That was the moment I decided. If Sheriff Sheila wanted to drown me in legal troubles, I would bury her career in paperwork. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees surrounding my modest 2-bedroom home on the outskirts of Millfield, population 2,876. For 3 generations, my family had called this drought-prone county home. My grandfather taught me everything about respecting the land and its resources. "Take only what you need and waste nothing," he would say as we tended the vegetable garden together. When I inherited the property 5 years ago, the region was entering its worst drought in decades. Water restrictions became increasingly severe. Neighbors watched their gardens wither and their water bills soar. That was when I decided to honor my grandfather's legacy by installing a comprehensive rainwater harvesting system. I spent months researching sustainable designs, consulting with environmental engineers, and carefully planning every component. 6 large collection barrels connected to my gutters formed the heart of the system. The collected rainwater passed through a series of filters before being stored in underground tanks. I used this water primarily for my garden and outdoor cleaning, reducing my municipal water usage by nearly 60%. The system became my pride and joy. I added moisture sensors, automated filtration, and even ultraviolet purification. Fellow gardeners from the community often stopped by to admire the setup. Several neighbors had expressed interest in building similar systems for their own homes. The first Saturday of every month, Millfield held its community farmers market in the town square. Local growers, artisans, and food vendors gathered to sell their goods and catch up on town happenings. My modest vegetable stand had become something of an attraction, with people marveling at how I maintained such thriving produce despite the water restrictions. "Your tomatoes are spectacular this season," Mrs. Henderson remarked, selecting 3 plump specimens. "What is your secret during this drought?" Before I could respond, a sharp voice interjected. "Yes, I would be very interested to hear that myself." I turned to face Sheriff Sheila Mathers, Millfield's law enforcement officer of 15 years. Though barely 5'4", her presence dominated any space she occupied. Her perfectly pressed uniform, reflective sunglasses, and perpetually stern expression had become fixtures of daily life in our small town. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said politely. "Just good old-fashioned rainwater collection and careful gardening." Sheriff Sheila picked up one of my bell peppers, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Rainwater collection, you say? That requires proper permits in this county. I trust everything is in order with your system." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. "Of course. I researched all applicable regulations before installation. She returned the pepper to my display with deliberate slowness. Rule benders always think they have found the perfect loophole, until they have not. With that cryptic warning, she continued her patrol through the market. Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Sheila had developed a reputation for selective enforcement, rigidly applying obscure regulations against those who challenged her authority, while overlooking infractions from her favored citizens. 3 days later, the knock came. I was preparing dinner when I heard 3 sharp raps on my front door. Through the window, I could see a county sheriff's vehicle parked in my driveway. Sheriff Sheila stood on my porch, ticket book already in hand. Behind her, the setting sun cast long shadows across my yard, illuminating my rainwater collection barrels like evidence at a crime scene. "Good evening," I said, attempting to keep my voice steady. "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" "Ordinance violation," she replied curtly, already writing. "Unauthorized water collection system without proper county certification." "There must be some mistake," I protested. "I researched all the regulations carefully before installing anything. The Residential Rainwater Collection Ordinance specifically permits systems under 800 gallons without special permits." Sheriff Sheila looked up from her citation book, her expression unchanging. "Section 12, Paragraph B of the updated county water regulations requires certification for any collection system connected to underground storage, which yours clearly is." She tore the ticket from her book and extended it toward me. $500 fine, due within 30 days, and you will need to decommission this system until properly certified. I took the citation with trembling hands, scanning the details in disbelief. But that amendment cannot possibly apply retroactively to existing systems. That would be. "Laws apply when and how they are meant to apply," Sheriff Sheila interrupted. "If you have concerns, you can contest the citation in court, though I would not recommend it. Judge Harmon takes water conservation regulations very seriously." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at my carefully constructed rainwater system. "I will be checking back to ensure compliance. Have a pleasant evening." As Sheriff Sheila drove away, I stood in my doorway clutching the citation, my mind racing. Something felt deeply wrong about this encounter. It was not just about water collection. It felt personal, targeted. What I did not realize then was that this simple citation was merely the opening move in Sheriff Sheila's campaign against me. The citation sat on my kitchen table as I pored over county ordinances late into the night. 3 separate legal documents were spread before me, illuminated by my desk lamp. The Millfield County Water Conservation Act, the Residential Environmental Modifications Guidelines, and the most recent county commissioners' meeting minutes. After 4 hours of meticulous reading, I confirmed my suspicion. Section 12, Paragraph B, the very regulation Sheriff Sheila had cited, specifically exempted residential systems installed before the amendment took effect 6 weeks ago. My system had been operational for nearly 5 years. The citation was completely baseless. Sleep eluded me that night as I contemplated my next steps. The following morning, I gathered all relevant documentation, including dated photographs of my installation, original receipts, and the highlighted ordinance exemption. Perhaps this was simply a misunderstanding that could be resolved through proper channels. The Millfield Sheriff's Department occupied a red brick building at the edge of the town square. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and coffee. Deputy Rawlins manned the front desk, his expression shifting subtly when I explained my purpose. "Sheriff Sheila is in her office. Let me see if she is available," he said, reaching for the phone with noticeable reluctance. After a brief conversation, he directed me down the hallway. Sheriff Sheila sat behind a large oak desk adorned with commendations and photographs of her shaking hands with various county officials. She did not invite me to sit. I reviewed the water ordinance carefully, I began, placing my documentation on her desk. My system is explicitly exempt under the grandfather clause of Section 12. Paragraph B, the citation appears to be issued in error. Sheriff Sheila did not touch the papers. Those exemptions apply only to systems that were properly registered at their time of installation. There was no registration requirement 5 years ago, I countered, pulling out the historical version of the ordinance. The original regulation only specified size limitations and runoff management, both of which my system meets. Sheriff Sheila leaned forward slightly. Perhaps you misunderstood the original requirements. That happens frequently with amateur environmentalists. Her dismissive tone ignited a spark of indignation within me. I have copies of all applicable regulations dating back 7 years. There was never any registration requirement for residential systems under 800 gallons. Something cold flashed in Sheriff Sheila's eyes. Mr. Reynolds from the County Water Authority consulted on your citation. Are you suggesting he does not understand the regulations he helps enforce? I am only pointing out what the written ordinance clearly states, I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. Sheriff Sheila stood abruptly. This meeting is over. If you wish to contest the citation, you may do so through proper judicial channels. Filing deadline is this Friday. As I gathered my documents, she added, and while reviewing your property, I noticed several other potential code violations that warrant investigation. Expect additional inspections in the coming days. The implicit threat hung in the air between us. This was no longer about rainwater collection. It was about power and control. True to her word, patrol cars began appearing near my property with alarming frequency. Deputies would drive by slowly, sometimes stopping to photograph my house and yard. Neighbors began asking if everything was all right, their concerned expressions revealing a mixture of sympathy and fear that whatever had attracted the sheriff's attention might somehow spread to them. Within a week, 2 additional citations arrived, one for excessive vegetation encroachment on public easement, referring to my wildflower garden that had existed for decades, and another for an unpermitted garden shed structure, my grandfather's tool cabinet that had stood beside the house since the 1970s. Each citation carried substantial fines and demands for immediate remedy. The financial burden was becoming significant, but the emotional toll weighed even heavier. My once peaceful home now felt like a target, my every action potentially scrutinized for violations of ordinances I had never known existed. I contested each citation through the proper channels, gathering evidence and preparing my case meticulously. The morning of my hearing for the original water citation arrived. I sat in the small county courtroom, documentation organized in a binder before me. Sheriff Sheila entered with Mr. Reynolds from the Water Authority. They spoke quietly at the front of the room, occasionally glancing in my direction. Judge Harmon entered, and the proceedings began. I presented my case carefully, citing the specific ordinance language that exempted my system. Mr. Reynolds countered with complex technical arguments about water table impacts and downstream effects, concerns never mentioned in the actual citation. When Judge Harmon ruled in favor of the county, I felt a cold realization settle over me. This was not justice. It was a performance with a predetermined outcome. The breaking point came 3 days later. I returned home from work to find 3 sheriff's department vehicles parked in my driveway. Sheriff Sheila stood in my front yard, directing deputies as they disconnected my rainwater barrels and loaded them onto a truck. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the spectacle unfold. "What is happening here?" I demanded, hurrying from my car. "You cannot just take my property." Sheriff Sheila held up a document. "Court order for equipment seizure, signed this morning by Judge Harmon. Your continued operation of an uncertified water collection system constitutes willful defiance of county regulations." "I was given 30 days to remedy the situation," I protested. "It has been barely 2 weeks." "The timeline was accelerated due to drought emergency provisions," she replied with unmistakable satisfaction. "The county cannot risk unauthorized water diversion during a critical shortage period." I watched helplessly as they dismantled my carefully constructed system, loading components into their truck while neighbors observed my public humiliation. 5 years of work, thousands of dollars in equipment, and countless hours of planning, all taken away by a sheriff with a personal vendetta. As Sheriff Sheila prepared to leave, she paused beside me. "Perhaps next time you will think twice before assuming you know better than county authorities. Some lessons must be learned the hard way." In that moment, something fundamental shifted within me. The anger and helplessness crystallized into determination. If Sheriff Sheila wanted to weaponize bureaucracy against me, she would soon discover she was not the only one who could navigate the system. The evening after the seizure, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by scattered papers and a deep sense of violation. The bare spots where my rainwater barrels had stood were visible through the window, constant reminders of Sheriff Sheila's unchecked authority. My initial instinct was to retreat, to accept defeat and avoid further targeting, but something within me refused to surrender. I reached for a notebook and wrote "Document everything" at the top of the first page. If this was to become a battle of paperwork and procedure, I needed to be methodical. That night, I recorded every interaction with Sheriff Sheila and her deputies in meticulous detail: dates, times, exact words spoken, witnesses present. I pulled out my phone and downloaded a call recording application, then researched my state's laws regarding documentation of public officials performing their duties. The next morning, I visited the county clerk's office. Martha Jennings had worked there for over 30 years and knew the filing system better than anyone. I requested copies of all ordinances related to water usage, property maintenance, and code enforcement. "That is quite a comprehensive request," Martha noted, peering at me over her reading glasses. "Any particular reason for your sudden interest in county regulations?" I hesitated, then decided honesty might yield more information. "Sheriff Sheila has issued several citations against my property. I want to understand exactly what regulations apply and how enforcement typically works." Martha's expression shifted subtly. "I see." She lowered her voice. "You might want to look at the monthly enforcement reports as well. Public record, though not many citizens know to ask for them." The enforcement reports proved invaluable. Each month, the sheriff's department submitted documentation of all citations issued, organized by type and location. I requested the past 2 years of reports and spent days analyzing the patterns. A disturbing picture emerged. Sheriff Sheila's enforcement actions showed clear clustering around specific individuals or neighborhoods, often following public disagreements or perceived slights against her authority. At the farmer's market that Saturday, I noticed Thomas Bedford, whose organic farm had once been the largest in the county. Now he operated a much smaller booth selling only honey and preserves. "Your rainwater system," he said when I approached him. "I heard what happened. Same thing occurred with my irrigation setup 3 years ago. Over coffee after the market closed, Thomas shared his experience. After questioning one of Sheriff Sheila's fundraising initiatives at a town meeting, he found himself subjected to relentless inspections and citations. Eventually, the legal costs and fines forced him to sell most of his farmland. "I should have fought harder," he admitted, "but I did not know how, and I could not afford an attorney specializing in municipal law." Thomas introduced me to Sarah Gunderson, whose small bakery had closed following a series of health code violations that began after she refused to donate to Sheriff Sheila's preferred charity. Then came Michael Torres, whose building permit applications were mysteriously delayed for months after a minor traffic dispute with the sheriff. A pattern emerged with each new story. Sheriff Sheila did not merely enforce the law, she wielded it selectively as an instrument of control and retribution. More disturbing was how the system supported her actions. Judge Harmon consistently ruled in her favor. The county commissioners deferred to her judgment on enforcement priorities. Even the local newspaper rarely questioned her authority. "You need to speak with Robert Chen," Michael suggested. "He retired as deputy county clerk last year. He knows where all the procedural bodies are buried." Robert lived in a small house filled with books on administrative law and local government. He had spent 40 years navigating the labyrinthine structure of county bureaucracy. When I explained my situation, he nodded knowingly. "Sheriff Sheila has become accustomed to operating without meaningful oversight," Robert explained. "But the system that grants her power also creates accountability pathways, if you know precisely where to look." Over the next several weeks, Robert became my mentor in procedural warfare. He explained the intricacies of administrative complaints, records requests, and regulatory oversight mechanisms that existed beyond Judge Harmon's courtroom. We spent evenings poring over county charters, state regulatory frameworks, and federal guidelines that applied to local law enforcement. "The key is documentation and persistence," Robert emphasized. "Most citizens give up after the first rejection. Bureaucracy counts on that fatigue, but every official action creates a paper trail, and every paper trail can be followed." My home gradually transformed into an investigation headquarters. One wall became dedicated to a timeline of Sheriff Sheila's enforcement actions against me and others. Another displayed the complex organizational chart of county government, with red strings connecting oversight relationships and reporting requirements. My dining table disappeared beneath stacks of ordinances, procedural manuals, and public records. I installed a security camera system to document any official visits to my property. I carried a small voice recorder whenever I left home. Each interaction with Sheriff Sheila or her deputies was meticulously logged, photographed, and filed. What had begun as self-defense evolved into a comprehensive investigation of systematic abuse of power. Meanwhile, Sheriff Sheila continued her campaign. 2 more citations arrived, one for non-standard mailbox height, and another for improper disposal of yard waste based on leaves that had fallen from my oak tree. Each time I documented the citation, requested all related records, and filed the information in my growing archive. The weekly support group that had organically formed in my living room continued to grow. Thomas, Sarah, Michael, and others shared their experiences and contributed records of their own encounters. Together, we mapped Sheriff Sheila's history of targeted harassment. Robert guided us through the procedural maze, identifying vulnerabilities in her enforcement methods. "She has become sloppy," Robert observed one evening as we reviewed her recent citations. 15 years of unopposed authority has made her careless about following proper procedures. Every shortcut she takes is a potential leverage point. I discovered Sheriff Sheila rarely filed complete documentation for property inspections. Her deputies frequently conducted searches without proper notification. Citation language often failed to reference specific ordinance sections. Administrative deadlines were missed, then backdated. Each procedural violation was minor in isolation, but formed a damning pattern when compiled. The system protects itself, Robert warned. A frontal attack against Sheriff Sheila will fail because those in power benefit from her methods. Your strategy must be procedural rather than personal. I nodded, understanding now what needed to be done. We will not attack Sheriff Sheila directly. We will simply request that every procedure be followed exactly as written. We will drown her in the very bureaucracy she has weaponized against others. That night, after everyone had left, I stood before my wall of evidence. Dozens of documented violations of procedure, hundreds of pages of selective enforcement records, statements from 17 citizens who had experienced similar targeting. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of empowerment. Sheriff Sheila had spent years using her badge and the complexity of legal bureaucracy as weapons. She never expected that someone would have the patience and determination to turn that same system against her. I would not seek revenge through confrontation or public accusations. My vengeance would come through meticulous adherence to every administrative requirement, every reporting obligation, every procedural detail she had long ignored. The transformation was complete. I was no longer merely a victim of Sheriff Sheila's abuse of power. I had become a student of the system she exploited, and I was ready to begin my counteroffensive. The first phase of my counter-strategy began on a Monday morning. I arrived at the county administration building precisely at 8 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio containing 15 meticulously prepared documents. The receptionist recognized me from my previous visits and eyed the thick folder with apprehension. "I need to file these Freedom of Information Act requests, please," I stated calmly, placing the stack on the counter. "Each requires a separate receipt and tracking number according to County Procedure Manual Section 4.3. The requests were comprehensive. I sought all inspection reports conducted by Sheriff Sheila in the past 5 years, complete enforcement statistics by neighborhood, documentation of training certifications for all deputies conducting code enforcement, and internal communications regarding my property. Each request cited specific statutes establishing my right to the information. 3 days later, I returned with another batch, this time formal complaints addressed to various oversight bodies. One detailed procedural violations in the seizure of my rainwater system. Another documented the pattern of selective enforcement against specific citizens. A third challenged the legal basis for several citations. Each complaint required a formal acknowledgement and investigation timeline according to county charter. At first, Sheriff Sheila appeared unconcerned by these nuisance filings, as she called them. I observed her at the farmer's market that Saturday, confidently patrolling as always. When our paths crossed, she offered a condescending smile. "Still upset about your little water barrels?" she asked. "Paperwork will not bring them back." I maintained a neutral expression. "I am simply exercising my rights as a citizen." "Filing papers will not change anything," she replied dismissively. "The system works the way it is supposed to work." "Yes," I agreed. "Eventually it does." The following week brought the first administrative deadlines for responses to my information requests. As Robert had predicted, the sheriff's department requested extensions on most items. I immediately filed procedural objections to each extension request, citing the specific criteria for delays and demonstrating how each failed to meet the statutory requirements. Sheriff Sheila was now legally obligated to personally sign dozens of response documents. Deputy Rawlins began calling me with increasingly desperate requests for timeline accommodations. The sheriff has actual law enforcement duties, he explained during one call, which I dutifully recorded. These administrative requests are consuming resources needed for public safety. I understand completely, I responded. However, administrative compliance is also a statutory obligation. Perhaps prioritization decisions should be reconsidered if current staffing is insufficient for both functions. By the third week, the strain began to show. I observed Sheriff Sheila at the county building, engaged in an animated discussion with the records administrator. Her typically immaculate uniform appeared slightly rumpled, her posture tense. When she noticed me watching, her expression hardened into a glare. The first substantial response to my information requests arrived heavily redacted. I immediately filed appeals for each redaction, citing the specific transparency requirements that had been violated. Each appeal required a formal review by the county attorney's office. Meanwhile, news of my bureaucratic resistance spread through informal channels. Other citizens who had experienced Sheriff Sheila's targeted enforcement began to contact me. Our weekly meetings grew larger, with new faces bringing new stories and additional documentation. Thomas Bedford introduced me to Janet Murphy, the editor of the neighboring county's newspaper. Unlike Millfield's local paper, hers operated independently of county influence. I have been hearing about enforcement disparities in Millfield for years, Janet explained during our meeting at a cafe well outside Sheriff Sheila's jurisdiction. But no one has been willing to provide documentation or go on record. I showed her a carefully prepared statistical analysis of Sheriff Sheila's citation patterns, with identifying information removed to protect privacy. The data revealed unmistakable clustering of enforcement actions against specific individuals following public disagreements with the sheriff. "This is compelling," Janet acknowledged. "Would you be willing to be interviewed for a feature story?" The article appeared 2 weeks later, Patterns of Power, Questions of Selective Enforcement in Millfield County. Though carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, it raised serious questions about the distribution of citations and included anonymized accounts from several citizens. Sheriff Sheila's reaction was immediate and fierce. She issued a public statement denouncing the article as irresponsible journalism based on manipulated statistics provided by disgruntled ordinance violators. She demanded a retraction and threatened legal action against the newspaper. Janet published Sheriff Sheila's response in full, alongside the complete statistical dataset that supported the original story. The expanded public scrutiny created new pressure points. County commissioners began receiving questions about enforcement patterns from constituents. The State Law Enforcement Standards Division requested clarification on certain procedures mentioned in the newspaper article. Each inquiry generated new paperwork requirements for Sheriff Sheila and her department. My most strategic filing came after careful preparation. Using information obtained through my earlier requests, I submitted a comprehensive ethics complaint to the State Oversight Board for Law Enforcement. The 27-page document detailed specific procedural violations, complete with dates, file numbers, and statutory references. The complaint did not allege corruption or abuse. It simply documented dozens of instances where established procedures had not been properly followed. State-level complaints triggered mandatory investigation protocols outside Sheriff Sheila's sphere of influence. Within days, she received formal notification that investigators would be reviewing her department's records and interviewing personnel. I encountered Sheriff Sheila at the grocery store the following evening. The confident swagger that had characterized her movements for 15 years was noticeably diminished. Dark circles had formed beneath her eyes. When she saw me, she quickly moved to another aisle. The cascade effect was now in full motion. Each response to an information request revealed new procedural violations, which generated new complaints, which triggered new investigations, which required more responses. The interlocking bureaucratic machinery that had once served as Sheriff Sheila's weapon now functioned exactly as designed, but against her. At a county commissioners' meeting, Sheriff Sheila requested an emergency budget allocation for administrative support personnel to handle the unprecedented volume of frivolous information requests and complaints. When Commissioner Williams asked for specific examples of frivolous requests, Sheriff Sheila fumbled through her notes, unable to identify any that did not cite legitimate statutory authority. Perhaps, Commissioner Williams suggested, the solution is not additional staffing, but improved compliance with existing procedures to reduce complaint volume. As I left the meeting, Deputy Rawlins approached me in the hallway. "What exactly do you want?" he asked quietly. "This cannot continue indefinitely." I met his gaze steadily. "I want exactly what Sheriff Sheila has always claimed to want: full compliance with the law. Every regulation followed, every procedure respected, every citizen treated equally under properly executed authority. Nothing more, nothing less." The deputy studied my face for a long moment. "She underestimated you." "No," I corrected him. "She underestimated the system. I am merely ensuring it functions as designed." As I walked to my car that evening, I realized how profoundly the dynamic had shifted. For the first time since moving to Millfield, I felt no anxiety at the sight of a sheriff's vehicle. I had transformed from powerless victim to knowledgeable citizen exercising legitimate authority. Sheriff Sheila still wore the badge, but the foundation of her power was eroding with each document I filed. The county meeting room had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, with additional citizens standing along the walls. At the front table sat the 7 county commissioners, the county attorney, and representatives from the State Oversight Board for Law Enforcement. Sheriff Sheila occupied a chair to one side, flanked by her attorney. 6 months had passed since my first Freedom of Information request. The cascade of paperwork had grown into an avalanche that could no longer be contained within administrative channels. Today, the State Oversight Board would present its preliminary findings regarding procedural compliance in the Millfield Sheriff's Department. Commissioner Blackwell gavelled the meeting to order. "We begin with the presentation of investigative findings by Director Hammond from the State Oversight Board." Director Hammond, a gray-haired woman with steel-rimmed glasses, approached the podium. "Our investigation was initiated following receipt of a documented complaint alleging systematic procedural violations within the Millfield County Sheriff's Department. The original complaint contained 73 specific allegations with supporting documentation." She adjusted her glasses. "Our preliminary investigation substantiated 49 of these allegations as demonstrable violations of established procedure." A murmur rippled through the crowded room. Sheriff Sheila stared straight ahead, her face expressionless. "The violations fall into several categories," Director Hammond continued. "First, selective enforcement patterns that deviate significantly from statistical norms without documented justification. Second, improper documentation of inspection protocols. Third, failure to provide legally required notification before enforcement actions. Fourth, inconsistent application of ordinance interpretations dependent on the citizen involved. For the next 40 minutes, Director Hammond methodically outlined each category of violation, providing specific examples without naming individual citizens. The pattern she described was unmistakable, a law enforcement approach that varied dramatically based on personal relationships and perceived challenges to authority. When Director Hammond concluded, Commissioner Blackwell opened the floor for public comment. One by one, citizens approached the microphone to share their experiences. Thomas Bedford described the systematic harassment that had cost him his farm. Sarah Gunderson detailed the suspicious timing of health inspections following her charity dispute. Michael Torres explained the mysterious delays in his permit applications. Throughout the testimonies, Sheriff Sheila conferred urgently with her attorney. When the public comment period ended, she requested permission to address the gathering. These accusations represent a coordinated attempt to undermine legitimate law enforcement in our county, Sheriff Sheila began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated citizens for years. Every citation issued by my department was based on actual violations of county ordinances. The timing that some find suspicious was simply the result of complaint-driven enforcement patterns. Her attorney handed her a folder. I have here documentation of legitimate violations for each case mentioned today. Mr. Bedford's irrigation system exceeded allowable specifications. Ms. Gunderson's bakery had documented sanitation issues. Mr. Torres submitted incomplete permit applications. She placed the folder on the table with a definitive thud. As for the procedural complaints, I acknowledge that in our commitment to efficient enforcement, certain administrative protocols may have been abbreviated. This represents an opportunity for procedural improvement, not evidence of improper conduct. Commissioner Williams leaned forward. Sheriff Sheila, the issue before us is not whether violations existed, but whether enforcement has been applied equally and procedures followed consistently. The statistical evidence suggests enforcement intensity varied by factors unrelated to violation severity. Statistics can be manipulated, Sheriff Sheila countered. My department prioritizes resources based on public safety impact. Which brings us to a critical finding, Director Hammond interjected. Our review of communication records indicates that enforcement priorities were frequently adjusted following personal interactions, rather than documented risk assessments. This pattern is most evident in the case that initially triggered our investigation. All eyes turned toward me. I had not shared my identity as the original complainant, but many had guessed. Director Hammond continued. The rainwater collection system that prompted multiple citations and equipment seizure was, according to county regulations in effect at the time of installation, fully compliant with all applicable standards. The enforcement action occurred after a documented exchange at a public gathering and relied on retroactive application of regulations, explicitly excluded from such application by their own statutory language. Sheriff Sheila's face flushed. That system violated the spirit of water conservation regulation, if not the technical letter. My job is protecting this community, not navigating bureaucratic loopholes. The law is not a loophole, Commissioner Blackwell stated firmly. It is the framework within which all authority must operate, including yours, Sheriff. The meeting continued for another hour as the commissioners deliberated on appropriate remedial actions. By the time they announced their decision, Sheriff Sheila sat rigid in her chair, Her earlier confidence entirely evaporated. The remedies were comprehensive: mandatory procedural retraining for all department personnel, implementation of a transparent citation review process, reassignment of code enforcement responsibilities to a newly created civilian division, and formal censure of Sheriff Sheila for demonstrated patterns of procedural noncompliance. Most significantly for me, the commissioners ordered immediate return of all confiscated property related to residential rainwater collection systems installed prior to the regulatory amendment, with compensation for any damages incurred. As the meeting adjourned, citizens gathered in small groups, their expressions revealing a mixture of vindication and disbelief. Sheriff Sheila exited quickly through a side door, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Deputy Rawlins approached me as I gathered my documentation. "Your equipment will be returned tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "The department will coordinate with you regarding installation assistance." I nodded, feeling no triumph or gloating, only a profound sense of restoration. "Thank you." 2 weeks later, my rainwater collection system was fully reinstalled, now with official county certification prominently displayed. The following Saturday, I returned to the farmer's market with the first harvest from my rejuvenated garden. Several neighbors approached with questions about installing their own collection systems. Sheriff Sheila's cruiser still patrolled Millfield streets, but citizens no longer tensed at its appearance. Her authority remained, but now properly constrained by the system she had once manipulated. I occasionally saw her at public events, her manner notably subdued, her interactions with citizens careful and strictly professional. Late one afternoon, as I tended my garden, a county vehicle pulled into my driveway. Commissioner Williams stepped out, admiring the reconstructed rainwater system. "Quite an impressive setup," she commented. "The County Environmental Office is developing a program to encourage similar installations throughout the region. We would appreciate your input as someone with practical experience." I straightened from my gardening. I would be happy to contribute. The commissioner nodded toward my house. "Your actions created significant changes in our county governance, not through confrontation or scandal, but through persistent insistence that the system work as designed. Justice does not always require dramatic confrontation," I reflected. "Sometimes it simply requires making the machinery of accountability function correctly." "Indeed," Commissioner Williams smiled. "Though I must admit, drowning someone in paperwork is perhaps the most appropriately ironic form of justice I have ever witnessed." As she departed, I surveyed my property, the garden flourishing with sustainably collected rainwater, the barrels once again collecting precious resources, the community slowly healing from years of unchecked authority. Sheriff Sheila had given me a ticket for using rainwater. In response, I had not sought her humiliation or removal but something far more powerful: systematic accountability. The lesson had spread throughout Millfield. Citizens now attended county meetings, requested public records, and engaged with governance processes. The system that had once been weaponized against individuals now functioned as intended, as a framework ensuring authority remained the servant of the community rather than its master. I adjusted one of the collection barrels, watching as raindrops began to fall from gathering clouds. Each drop represented a small contribution to something sustainable and life-giving, much like the individual documents I had filed. Each one a seemingly insignificant drop that, when combined with others, had created an unstoppable current of accountability.